All right, welcome back for part 4 of our series on Microsoft Forms, Power Automate, and file uploads. And in this video, we are going to talk about what to do with those files. So in the last video, we basically talked about getting the file data, so the file names, and then the file content, and we shoved those into a variable, an array variable called var files. And that gives you a lot of flexibility because there are certain actions where you can simply take that array variable and use it directly. We'll get to that. But there are other cases where essentially especially if you've got more than one file that's being attached to that form, or I should say more than one file attached to that particular question, you can essentially perform the same action for each file in that array. So send them, create them in a new folder, create them in a OneDrive folder, etc. But basically, once you have them in an array, anything you can do with an array, you can do with those files. So first off, we're going to talk about emailing, because this is the thing that everyone seems to want to do with these files. Is they get a file attached to a form, then they want to email that file to someone. So rather than having people go to the file, go to the folder where those files are being stored, they want to send it as an attachment. And I can't argue that this is a valid, that it's a useful scenario. I, however, will continue to stay on the platform that I don't really generally like sending file attachments, just because email was never meant to be a file transfer mechanism, and the fact that people use it as such can lead to problems. Things like sending too many attachments or attachments that are too large. So if your form is collecting files that may be very large, audio or video files, anything that's going to be more than maybe a couple hundred megabytes. I don't know what the default limit is on attachment sizes these days in Exchange Online or other mail services, but the bottom line is if you have a lot of large files attached, sending them as an email attachment is going to get you in trouble. But in most cases, the files attached to these forms are fairly small. In fact, in the question settings in the form, you can control the maximum size of the file attachment. So you might want to do that if your goal is to email the files. Now, there are basically 3 mail actions that I'm going to talk about. And the reason I'm focusing on these 3, and really it's just going to be 2 that I'm going to demonstrate, but the third is very similar to the second, is that these are standard connectors or standard actions in Power Automate. So if you have a Microsoft 365 A5, E5, E3 or A3 license, you have access to these in Power Automate. So we're not talking any premium connectors or premium actions, and so you'll be able to do exactly these things. Now the first one is the mail connector, and I call this the generic mail connector. Because it sends from a Microsoft Service account that's actually, the email address I believe is mapps@powerapps.com or powerapps.microsoft.com, something like that. And the sender name is Microsoft Power Apps and Power Automate. So it is kind of generic and could be perceived as fishy or spammy to some people. So I used to use this a lot because, especially in flows that ran as part of a Power App, because users of the app didn't quite understand why the app would need to send email. And if I use the Outlook connector, it would ask for access to their Outlook account. And some users are, rightfully suspicious of those prompts. So I started using this mail connector as something that would send an email without actually using the end user's mailbox. However, over the years, there have been other ways that have, replaced that. Won't get into those right now, but just I've kind of used this less, but it's still something that could be useful for sending a specific email to, someone, as long as you're not too hung up on the sender being that Microsoft account. The other option you have is the Office 365 Outlook connector, and there are really two send emails. There are other send email actions, like there's a send email with options. We're not going to get into that. But basically, send an email v2 is really just as if you were to open Outlook and compose a message from your mailbox and send it. In fact, when you use this action in your flows, the message shows up, the sent message goes into your sent items. And if people reply to the message, you get the reply. So it is literally using your mailbox to send that message. The other option, or the other one I'm going to talk about, which is really the same, it's just rather than sending from your mailbox, it will be sending from a shared mailbox. The configuration of both of these is the same, other than supplying the name of the shared mailbox for the second one. And I really like using shared mailboxes, especially related to forms, because often those forms are bound to some department or group or process, and that department or group or process might already have a shared mailbox. So it's very natural that, if I'm filling out this form for COVID contact tracing, and I get an email back from COVID contact tracing at domain.com, it makes sense. It's logical. So it allows you that ability to kind of tie the mailbox name or the sender name to the form in a logical way, as opposed to it coming from a person who may or may not, the person filling out the form may or may not know who it is that email is coming from. Anyway, so let's first take a look at the send an email notification, the generic one. Now, the catch with this one, and I'm just going to add it here below our reply to each, and it's in the mail connector, and it's the only action there. So I can basically address this to an address, I can set a subject, I can add the body, and then in the advanced options, if I look down, I can attach one file. So it's asking me for the content of the attachment and the name of the attachment. So I can't get that in, outside of this apply to each. Now, technically I could. There are ways to get that, but I'm going to show you the easier way to handle this. Assuming you have a single file and you want to work with this in one, doing one particular thing, basically just move that send an email notification inside the apply to each that's building the array variable. It's really that easy. Then inside of here, you can simply use the attachment for the attachment content. It's going to be this file content output, and for the attachment name, it's going to be the name from the Parse JSON. Just like in, just like we used to build that array variable. And in fact, because we're not even using the array variable now, you technically could delete this if you wanted to. You don't need it if this is what you're going to do. Now, again, the catch is that if you have let's say that there were 5 attachments to this one question that came in as part of this one Parse JSON, then this is going to send 5 separate emails, each one with a single file attachment. And that's because this connector, this action, only allows you to attach one file. So assuming let's say that you do need to send more than one attachment for a message. Let's delete this because that's not really going to help us. But let's say we did have 3 files, or we're going to allow up to 3 files for this one question, and we want to send all of those files in one email. In that case, what we need to do is use one of the Outlook actions. So I'm going to use the send an email v2, and again, the send an email from a shared mailbox will look very similar. We'll just have another field up here asking for the shared mailbox name. But again, we type in the subject, we type in the body, and then in the advanced options, this is where it's a little different. So we can see that it's got attachments name 1, attachments content 1, because this is allowing an array input. So in other words, because when you create an email in Outlook, you can attach 1 file or 10 files or 20 files if they're size small enough. So this is basically allowing you to attach multiple files, attach an array of files. Now, to specify the array, I do need to switch this from this array notation to what's called text, or the text notation, and in here I simply drop in var files. That's really easy. So I've now just, whatever number of files were attached, whatever number in that array, they will all be attached to this one email. Pretty clean and simple. And again, if I were sending from a shared mailbox, it'd be exactly the same. One bonus tip here, whenever you're using the Outlook send an email actions, the importance, if you do not specifically set it, will come across or come through as low. So you'll probably want to set this to normal, or maybe even high, depending on the actual importance of this email and these attachments. But I always 9 times out of 10 set it to normal. And I'm actually not going to save that, but that's basically sending it through an email. Now, if you don't want to send it through an email, what other things can we do? Let's just talk through this a little bit more. What else can we do with those files? We can save them somewhere else. So we know that those when it's a personal form, they're saved to the OneDrive of the owner, and if it's a group form, they're saved to the documents library in the SharePoint site of the group, and that's fine, but they're at this kind of circuitous path, so you might want to save them somewhere specific. So in other words, if it's, let's say it's a personal file or personal form and it's for a particular project I'm working on, I might already have a folder in my OneDrive where I want to save all those files. So I can use the create file action in OneDrive for Business to save them there. Also, if it's a SharePoint, if I want the files to be saved in SharePoint as opposed to OneDrive, there's a corresponding create file action in SharePoint, which lets you save to any SharePoint site and library where you have access to save files or create files. And it's important to note that even if it's a group form, I've had other people say, well, if it's a group form and they're saved in SharePoint, you just move the files. You actually can't, because at least I haven't figured out a way, because the identifier that the move file action needs isn't provided by the output from the form response or parsing the JSON of the file response questions or file upload questions. So bottom line is, you can't just move the file. You need to create a copy of the file, and then you might want to go back and delete the original file just to kind of prevent duplication, so you don't have every document in your site twice. But let's just talk through how will we use these. Now, I will say up front that neither of these are array aware as the the Outlook send email actions are in the attachments field. So if I want to add create a file here, I'll say create file and select the OneDrive for Business. It's asking for a folder path, so I can just I'll just select the root folder, and then it's asking for the name and the file content. Now again, there are ways I could specify the name by using the array notation and expression, which we're going to get to. But if I only have, because it's going to create files one by one, regardless of how I do it, whether I do it inside this apply to each loop or create a separate apply to each loop, it's creating files one at a time. So to keep things simple for right now, I'm going to just move this create file into the existing apply to each loop. So basically what I'm saying is, okay, create a file there and use as the file name the name from Parse JSON and the content from get file content. Done. Again, if I have one file, it's going to create one file. If I have 10 files, it's going to create 10 files at that path. So that's one way to use the using the create file action right inside the same apply to each that we're using to build the variable. Now, let's say you have multiple file upload questions in your form. You might have, one question that's asking for a cover letter, another one that's asking for a resume, and another one that's asking for a writing sample. And you want to compile all of those together into that one array, or that one files array, and then write all of those files in sequence. You could do 3 separate file create options, or create file actions into SharePoint or OneDrive. But let's talk about how, if we were building that array from different questions, how we can then work with that array to do the same thing. So I'm just going to delete my create file here, and we're going to collapse this down, and I'm going to add a new apply to each loop. And I almost never actually create apply to each loops because I just kind of let Power Automate throw them in there when necessary. So search for apply to each, add the apply to each control, and this will just name it apply to each 2. That's perfectly fine. And an apply to each loop takes as an input an array. So I'm just going to say, okay, for every file, every item that's in this var files array, I want to perform these steps. And what I want to do is create a file. And I'm going to, instead of OneDrive, this time I'm going to select SharePoint. And similarly, it's asking for a folder path, file name, and content, but it's also asking me for the site name, because again, it could be any site that I have access to. And I'll set it to Shared Documents. Now, because I'm in a separate loop, I can't simply say, I can't easily just say, give me the name from Parse JSON, because then that's going to insert another loop and create all kinds of weirdness. So let's not do that. What I need to do is instead say, I want to run this on, the first time this loop runs, run it on the first item in that array, and then for the second, run it on the second item. So in other words, the file name is going to be relative to the item in the array. And that's where we need to use basically the current iteration data. And if I scroll down to the bottom of our dynamic content, you'll see apply to each 2 current item. So I'm going to select that. Now that's actually giving me the whole item, so the name and the content bytes. And what I need to do is get just the name for this particular field. So we need to do a little bit of digging and then use an expression. And basically what we wanted to use is an expression called items. And the easiest way, unless you like typing these expressions out, the easiest way to get what we need is to go into the 3 dots and peek code. And this is going to give us, in that name, we've got items, apply to each 2. I'm just going to copy this part. So you don't need the @ symbol, you don't need the closing quote, just that part. Highlight it, copy it, and then click done. And then I'm just going to delete that. And then in the file name, in the dynamic content window here, select expression and paste. Kind of bugged me that paste isn't in the context menu there, but okay. So paste, items apply to each, and what do I want? Which property from that array do I want? I need to use a square bracket, single quote, capital NAME, name. So that's going to give us the name for the current iteration. And click OK, and it's done. Then for the file content, again, I'm going to go to expression, Control V, paste that in. This time I want to do square bracket, single quote, content bytes. Again, capital C, capital B. It has to match that exactly. Click OK, and there you go. Now this will look a little weird. That's just deal with it, because that's how it's going to look. But when I save this, it's now going to basically, when this flow runs, if there's one file, it's just going to create that one file. But if I had, let's say I had 4 separate file upload questions and I compiled all of them into that one var files array, I can very easily write them all by just using this one loop. So rather than having 4 separate create file actions for question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4, I'm just kind of batching it all together. So it makes it a little bit easier on you in the long run. All right, so this went a little longer than I expected, but hopefully this was useful to you. Again, how you actually use this, what you do with those files, and how you how you build your flow is dependent on your circumstances and what you need to do. But hopefully this series has been helpful in guiding you to understand how those file upload questions work, how to get the data from your form responses, how to get the file contents. Maybe you learn something about variables and arrays, and a few other things. So hopefully this is really useful to you. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments below, and have a great day.